Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of eTalks. Today, I have my wonderful professor, Professor Winkler. She is the director of the Department of Music at Rutgers University and is a professor of musicology. Her research focuses on English music as well as theater. So, Professor Winkler, thank you so much for joining us today. Could you talk a little bit more about yourself and the research that you do?
Sure, of course. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be talking with you today. A little bit about me. I'm a musicologist, so that means that I study music in a historical and cultural context. Um, as you've already heard, my area of inquiry is mostly English music, and I'm particularly interested in English theater music. And the scope of my interest is really huge because I go all the way back to Shakespeare, and I've published a lot on him and music in his plays. But then I go all the way into the current day with my work on Andrew Lloyd Webber, who's very different than Shakespeare.
Yeah, so for us, maybe let's get started on Shakespeare. For some of us, maybe we last heard about him in high school. So, how is he relevant today, or what about Shakespeare's work that just intrigued you so much to continue researching on it?
Yeah, well, like many of you, I really got into Shakespeare in high school and encountered him in high school. I remember reading Macbeth and Julius Caesar and Hamlet and really falling in love with the complex language. I was kind of on the edge in terms of what I was going to do with myself, if I was going to pursue acting or if I was going to pursue music performance. I finally landed on being a vocal performance major, but my love of Shakespeare never left me. And when I was an undergraduate, I had the opportunity of going to London and doing an immersive Shakespeare experience, which included working with some of the actors at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And so that just really underscored how much I loved Shakespeare. And then I got interested in the place of music in Shakespeare's plays. Um, Particularly, I guess my entry point into that was Hamlet and Ophelia's mad scene. Because in Hamlet, Ophelia goes mad, and the way that her madness is signified on stage is through her singing. And one of the things that I got to do as part of my study abroad experience was scene. And musical bits, we just some way, which made me think, what would people have done at the time? And reading into it, and learning about the ballads that Ophelia was actually singing, the popular music that she was reformulating and then singing. And then I got interested in how different companies are addressing that scene today. And so that was kind of a point of departure. So that brings, something of this early modern performance practice. Anytime Hamlet is performed today, there are these songs, and you have to decide as a theater company, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to replace the popular songs of Shakespeare's day with current popular music? Sometimes they do that. There's a company that's in Stanton, Virginia called the Blackfriars. And one of their approaches to music their ideas, well, back in the day, Shakespeare was sometimes appropriating popular music of his time. So why don't we replace some of these musical moments? Because Shakespeare's full of song. Why don't we replace some of those musical moments with current popular music? And so that's the approach that some companies do. And so I have gotten interested in how we approach these moments in the playtext where it says song or music. And so I've done work at various places with various collaborators on trying to bring that to life and using a variety of strategies.
Yeah, and which form have you found more successful in this endeavor? Where was it the popular, modernized popular songs, or staying true to what was written before?
I think it really, some of it depends on context. So I'll give an example. I think, and audience expectations. So because of, for example, I've mentioned the company, the Blackfriars Theater in Stanton, Virginia. The Royal Shakespeare Company, when they approach music in Shakespeare's plays or in classical theater, they have their own music department, at least for right now. I think it's under threat, sadly. But they have composers that write new music for them. At the Globe, at Shakespeare's Globe in London, they kind of made their name for a period of time doing something called original practices. And that meant that they were really invested in trying as much as possible to use the music from the time period, or potentially some of the ballads or tunes that people in Shakespeare's time would have known in their productions. And that was during the days when Mark Rylance, who's now a super duper famous actor, was the artistic director of the company. And his wife, the late Claire Van Campen, was their in-house composer. And she knew a lot about early music, so helped them figure out these scores. And those productions were super popular and super successful. In fact, one of the Globe productions traveled to Broadway, and their 12th night, Richard III double bill, came to Broadway and was performed with period music. So sack butts were heard on Broadway, this old version of a trombone,
Yeah.
and instruments you never hear on Broadway and the thing sold out. People were really hungry for it. On the other hand, if it weren't under the Globe brand, maybe that wouldn't have worked. It's about audience expectations, I think, and it's production specific. If the production has a clear idea of what they want to do and what they want to say with the production, then music can help tell that story. And I think the reason why some of these Globe original practices productions were so popular is because everything aligned to tell the story that they wanted to tell.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. And overall, so you're still continuing your work on, these Shakespeare's works. How can we bring Shakespeare back, or more so, should we bring him back to our modern youth, I guess, youth culture?
Yeah, I mean that is a great question, and it's something that a lot of us grapple with because there's so much wonderful um, work out there, and Shakespeare has had such laser focus, right? That sometimes it might have drawn away from other things which might be equally compelling or important. And so I think, obviously I love Shakespeare, but there are many, many, many other worthy playwrights and worthy theatrical traditions out there. And I would hope that even as Shakespeare still is performed and there's a place for him, that he becomes one of many, many different kinds of theater and kinds of music or theatrical music and plays that we might explore, because there's a lot of things out there in our big world that are equally worthy of staging and inquiry. For me, I would say Shakespeare continues to resonate and continues to be important and relevant because even though he was very much a man of his time with regards to some of his attitudes about women, about race, he was also extremely insightful about the human condition and very perceptive. And some of the things that he was grappling with in his plays about what happens after we die. What does it mean to be in community with other people? What happens when somebody is different than you? and how can we be in relationship with them? Or what does human prejudice do? That's something he explores across several plays. I think that those things are still very much worthy of grappling with. And I also think that reading Shakespeare or listening to him in a staged performance, it it's such dense language that it trains your brain in a specific kind of way. It's almost like grappling with a language that is not your own because it's so antiquated. And I think that learning how to grapple with it can be it can be very frustrating sometimes, but it can also be really enriching and beautiful. It's like many cultures have their own classical theater that requires a lot of attention because it often is coming or is a tradition from centuries past. It's not using current kinds of language, and yet there's a beauty in grappling with that. So Shakespeare, I think, has a lot to tell us even today that can be quite valuable to us in terms of understanding our human experience.
Yeah, thank you. That was a wonderful response. And on that note, as you said, especially Shakespeare's performances, they require lots of attention. So on another composer whose works also require much, much attention, Andrew Lloyd Webber, you have done significant research on him, and your specialization is, I believe, also on his musicals. So could you tell us a little bit about who this guy is, and what is his role in musicals?
Yeah. Oh, thanks so much for that pivot to Lloyd Webber. So Lloyd Webber, a little bit earlier, interested in Shakespeare because his work is more immediately accessible in many respects. Unlike Shakespeare, well, Shakespeare in his day was writing for a broad audience. He was writing for different classes. He was writing for not just for the elites, but for a very broad audience. And I think likewise, Lloyd Webber is writing for a very broad audience. However, because he's a more current composer, his work is more immediately accessible to people. I encountered him as a child when my mother bought the Evita concept album, and my sister and I memorized it. We probably should not have been listening to that album at the age we were because of language and content things. However, we did, and we learned it. And it was really compelling for both of us. And it was the first musical that I saw in the theater. And so it really shaped some of my musical interests. And I really liked the fact that it was sung all the way through. I'd never really grappled with opera per se at that time in my life, with the exception of seeing Humperdinck's Tom Gretel, the typical thing that you go to when your parents want you to see an opera as a little kid. But other than that, I knew nothing about opera, but I knew I liked that. And I liked the fact it was sung all the way through. So then I got interested a little bit later in my career, after I'd done all the work on early modern English drama. I really noticed some of these what we call dramaturgical similarities between what Lloyd Webber was doing and what some of these earlier composers were doing, operatic composers, but also specifically English composers. And so I got interested in thinking about Lloyd Webber within a socio-cultural context and how we can situate him within British culture more generally, what he's doing as a creator that might be distinctly British. He's oftentimes thought of as this global phenomenon, which is true, but there's some things he does that are quite rooted in British theatrical culture and British musical culture. His dad was a composer, a classical music composer, and he knows classical music very well. So that's what kind of led me to investigate Lloyd Webber and make that pivot. It was both my past as a music theater nerd, but also like some of these broader intellectual questions that I was interested in.
Yeah, yeah. So his works are incredible, and they're very popular. But I believe there was some backlash about the mega concept of the mega musical and how his works, they've also gotten great significant criticism for the capacity that it was made in. So could you tell us a little bit more about why this reaction happened?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, when his musicals really dominated in the 1980s, and when his works were all playing on Broadway. So you had Cats, you had Starlight Express, you had Phantom of the Opera, um, and Broadway felt like it was under siege by this. They even use these terms like the new British invasion, right? That this what Americans on Broadway believe to be this distinctly American art form that is musical theater, the Broadway musical was being subsumed or pushed to the margins by this genre that was oftentimes sung through, engaged heavily with popular music, um, and current popular musical forms. There's a lot of synth in some of those 80s Lloyd Webber shows. Some people felt as if it was kind of a debased version of opera, that it was kind of, he was just stealing from people like Puccini, and that it wasn't as good as some of these great classical composers of the past. And they also felt that it was full of all the spectacle and that he was overly commercial. So, and this came a lot from American critics. The New York Times was particularly unkind to Frank Rich, the critic there. And there was a certain kind of xenophobia with a lot of the criticism. Like they didn't like the fact that there was this foreign invader coming and taking over Broadway. His works tended to be more warmly received in the UK, particularly by newspapers, because in the UK there's certain newspapers that are aligned with certain political perspectives. The kind of more conservative press particularly liked Lloyd Webber's works. And you can understand why, because aesthetically, especially something like Phantom, is really looking back to the past or back to tradition in particular kinds of ways that makes it kind of culturally conservative in terms of the way it sounds.
Yeah, about that, about borrowing from the past, I also wanted to ask about that. So I know Andrew Lloyd Webber, he has received lawsuits for supposedly copying off or borrowing. I don't know what's the correct term to use. In his, for example, Phantom of the Opera, the famous riff that he has. I don't think he was sued for that one. But for the other parts and the melodies that he used, what is the line between borrowing from the past or just being inspired?
That's really a great question. So, composers have always cribbed from other people and they've always borrowed. The famous example that a lot of people cite is George Friedrich Handel, the Baroque composer who wrote The Messiah. He was constantly borrowing from other people and he'd just borrow big chunks. But then he made it his own and reworked it in certain kinds of ways. Lloyd Webber, he borrows a lot. He borrows something in Jesus Christ Superstar that's from Mendelssohn. He borrows a lot from Puccini. Memory is very Puccini-esque. Some people have cited a particular aria in Madama Butterfly that it's taking from. There, likewise, in Phantom, Music of the Night sounds a lot like an aria from La Fanciulla del West, another Puccini opera, and he was sued for that, and the Puccini estate did ding him, and there was some sort of settlement. But he's also kind of borrowed from popular music. So, for example, the famous Phantom theme, da 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 da, that thing is borrowed pretty obviously from a Pink Floyd song called Echoes. So, um, they didn't bother to sue. Pink Floyd didn't bother to sue
Right.
him for that. But you can find all these YouTube videos out there that are citing this plagiarism. I would say that oftentimes he might use these things, whether he knows it, it's conscious, it's unconscious. It's certainly there, and the similarities are certainly there. But he then oftentimes reformulates it, reuses it, it's orchestrated in a different kind of way. So it's not necessarily just a direct lift. The Echoes one, though, it's very similar, I will say. The Pink Floyd thing is pretty similar.
Yeah, so from what I understand, it's expected at one point that all composers at one point they do borrow from other materials, whether it be from the modern era or from the past. It's just a matter of, making it their own. And it should be accepted, I guess, because it's just, yeah, there's only so much music, right? One can originate.
Right.
Yeah.
The problem is that we live in a very litigious age. And when Handel was doing all his borrowing of his contemporaries and sometimes of himself, Lloyd Webber also borrows from himself quite heavily sometimes. But when Handel was doing it, there weren't all these strict copyright laws in the same kind of way, and he wasn't getting sued. But if you do it now, people are going to come for you because, for one thing, our notions of authorship have changed and ownership and authorship have changed. And for another thing, people are just really on the lookout for this. There's a whole field of musicology called forensic musicology, where you get hired as a consultant to track down these things. And you're like an expert witnesses at trials to kind of determine if this plagiarism. So yeah, it's more of a thing now.
Yeah, that's incredible. And on that note, so we talked about the criticism that Andrew Lloyd Webber received, but I believe your research also points out the recent reignitement of the interest and the popularity of his work and I guess I could give you the word from here.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm looking at in one of the final chapters of my book are all of these Lloyd Webber revivals that have come out. So, for example, the recent Sunset Boulevard, that was this really stripped down production that Jamie Lloyd did, starring Nicole Scherzinger. It did really well in London, and it was also really well reviewed in a way that was not necessarily the case of the original production. It was really well reviewed on Broadway. And there's been other ones as well that have come out recently. Evita is another one that Jamie Lloyd has recently reworked, and that was on the West End with Rachel Zegler. And that also was extremely well reviewed. So people are taking another look both at some of the scores and they kind of have held, that they've proven themselves, and they still sound fresh and good, some of them. And then also these stripped down productions, which is kind of what Jamie Lloyd does. You don't have all of the spectacle. You don't have all of the distraction. They're really minimalist productions. And so they live or die by the singing and the score. And on those items alone, they really can succeed in very interesting ways. There's also this really interesting production of Phantom that's in New York right now called Masquerade, which is an immersive Phantom experience. I haven't gone to see it yet, but some of my students have, and they say it's amazing and they're really into it. And so you are right there close with the cast, kind of going through the opera populaire and being in contact with Raoul and Christine and the Phantom up close and personal. So it's something that's taking, both the Jamie Lloyd productions that are very minimalist and stripped down and the Masquerade production, they are taking elements of avant-garde theater practice and applying them to Lloyd Webber, and the works still kind of hold water. So that's really interesting. Or in some cases, new things are revealed about the work when you don't have all of the spectacle and when you're just there and with the characters and listening to the score.
Yeah. On that note, what does give a musical depth, or what attributes do you look at to see if a musical is successful or not? You know how you had mentioned the minimalism that is in the recent renditions of these musicals. Is it about the minimalism? Is it about the score? Is it about the music? Or what is it about in general that gives a musical that success or that depth, I should say?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm going to give a similar answer as I did to your answer about the period music in Shakespeare. I think musicals work, or a production works, because you can have a production of the same musical that in one iteration will not work at all, and then in another one will. So a famous example is Merrily We Roll Along, Sondheim's Merrily We Roll Along. That when it first came out, it was a massive bomb. It was a production that did not work. It was a famous flop. Then more recently, it was reworked and redone on Broadway with Daniel Radcliffe and Jonathan Groff. And it worked beautifully, and it was a huge hit. And it was a case where there were some tweaks that were done. The production had a clear vision. The original production cast very, very young people, and this production cast people who are a little bit older. And so sometimes it's about who you've got in your cast, the directorial vision for the production, and the music, right? All three things have to work for a musical to work. You can't have one thing that works and then the production doesn't work, or the director, their vision doesn't work, or the cast doesn't work. There's so many components. There's a really interesting book by Bruce Curl called Unfinished Show Business. And in that book, he talks about how a musical isn't just the score. It's not just the notes on the page or the script. It's about how it gets realized, and performance and who the performers are a really key part of whether or not a musical works or doesn't work. There are some musicals, however, that can work in many different versions. And there are some musicals that are utterly tied to a particular star and their star turn, and they will flop every other time because that one compelling presence isn't there. So some of it does depend on the integrity of the score, and do the songs work? Does the score work? But then there's these other factors, this alchemy that happens because it is a deeply collaborative art form, just like opera, where you have to have all of these things in place, and when they click, it clicks, and the show can really run. When it does not work, when it does not click, it dies in a couple weeks.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for that response. And before I ask my last question, I wanted to ask you if there's anything you would like to go back to, or anything you'd like to add about what we've talked about so far.
Um, I'm trying to think if there's anything that we haven't covered. You've been very thorough.
Okay. Awesome.
Nothing that kind of like leaps to mind.
Okay, then my last question is just that with the musical industry, it's sort of been disconnected from our, the youth in, I don't know actually the time frame of what we can say, but unlike going to the cinema to watch a film, it's not normal, or I guess in the tradition of a teenager or someone in college, to just go and watch a musical. And there are reasons like this, maybe it's the tickets that are very expensive, but how can we bring the musical tradition back to the public, I should say?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest hurdles, I think, is the fact that musical theater, there are these, you know, it exists in the West End. And there are different, nodes around the world. There's, some really lively things happening in Germany and in Asia and in Turkey too. I mean, as I learned from you. But sometimes it's about getting to the location to see the show, which can be a financial burden. It's about ticket prices. It's way more expensive to see a Broadway musical now than it is to see an opera. And so it's out of reach for a lot of people to just pay for the tickets. I think that is something that Broadway has to solve. The only show since 2022, if I'm remembering correctly, that's made a profit, a new musical, is The Outsiders. And that's a pretty dire track record. And in part, it's because of the costs of mounting the shows. It's so expensive to mount a musical, and also the cost of tickets. And as AI has gotten involved in kind of making dynamic pricing, it's based on demand. And so which can block younger people from coming to see it. So I think that Broadway and commercial theater and musical theater really has to have a hard look at their economic model, because what they have going on right now is untenable for them as producers, but also to bring in vibrant new audiences and young audiences who might be interested in seeing these things, but simply cannot afford it. I mean, there have been shows in the past that have really broken through with young audiences. Hamilton is one, although that was massively expensive after a certain point. But then others like Spring Awakening or Rent before that, that really, sparked imaginations of young people and made them really go to see them. But we need to do something, or there needs to be something done about the pricing, because that really blocks a lot of people. And I also think there should be additional use of technology to make Broadway accessible, or pro shots of shows more accessible, more to broader audiences. Most recently, they did a pro shot of Merrily We Roll Along, which I can't remember if it's been in the cinema or will be in the cinema. Another one that was, obviously Hamilton. There was a pro shot that was broadcast on Disney, and then it was also in the theaters and the cinema. So I think that could be a way forward. That's something that in classical theater, for example, the National Theatre in the UK, they have put some of their stuff streaming and made it available. The Globe has an on-demand service that you can stream different productions with them for a reasonable price. I think that technology can be a way forward to making some of these things accessible to people who don't have access to a large urban environment.
Yeah, hopefully whoever is in charge listens to these wonderful, wonderful advice, and honestly, enables everyone to be able to reach this beautiful art form in general. And I know that was my last question, but while you were speaking, I thought, so for someone who's never maybe experienced a musical, what is your recommendation, perhaps one musical that you think would give them a good introduction into this world?
Oh my goodness, that's so hard. Because what one person might love, another person
Yeah.
might hate. I think it's probably to answer that question, I'd almost have to have a conversation with the person to see what kinds of things they like and then what they don't like. So if I'm talking to a person who really, really loves opera and likes through-sung things, I'd probably send them to one of the mega musicals. I might send them to Evita, or I might send them to Les Miserables, for example. If they're a person who hates opera, I might send them to something else entirely. If they're a person who really is interested in dramatic, how kind of clever lyrics, I'll send them to Sondheim because that's where you're going to find it. or I'd send them to Hamilton because I think that the lyrics in Hamilton are astonishingly virtuosic. If they really like rock music, I'd probably send them to Rent, or something like that, or popular music. But I sent them to would depend on what their interests were.
Thank you. I think that was a very, very wonderful summary. I guess I know from our audience that people are like, okay, I think I know where to go to next. So I think that was very helpful. Thank you so much, Professor Winkler, for this episode and for making time. This was very informative, both for me as a music student, and I'm sure for other people who might have not have that much experience in this music world. And we have one fun fact question we usually ask all of our all of our participants. For you, I would like to ask, what is a color that feels musical to you?
Red.
Red.
Red, because red for me is kind of a passionate color, and music always really engages my emotions in a way that nothing else does. It accesses something in me in an emotional register. So when I look at red, it feels fiery and passionate, and music often makes me feel that way too.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. Thank you so much for joining us as well. Again.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.